and welcome to the Kink Perspective. My name's Chris. I'm a psychotherapist and consultant. On today's show, first I want to start by thanking all of you, my growing listener base, and the community that's been showing up on social media to share these conversations that I'm having with you all, reflecting and even helping me push things deeper. Part of the reason today's show is happening is because of a question I received from somebody in Europe, and I think it's definitely worth exploring and kind of expanding on. You are all the reason this work has the reach it does, and I really don't take that lightly, so thank you. I'd also like to say, if you want to support the work that I do, there is a donation link in my show's description. Nothing is expected, but anything is always helpful. So let's get into it for today. Today, we're going to look at something that sits at the crossroads of erotic desire and psychological imprinting. Why do some of us eroticize punishment? And maybe more importantly, what are we really craving underneath it? This isn't about kink shaming or analyzing the people that are into a corner, right? It's not what I'm trying to do. It's about naming what so many of us carry without words. Because when discipline turns us on, when correction feels comforting, or even when punishment starts to feel like love, it is worth asking what made that connection form in the first place. In many trauma-informed or even DS dynamics, I see this pattern often. A submissive might ask me, if I crave being put in my place, is there something wrong? But sometimes when I look at this question, what they're really asking for is containment or regulation, possibly even forgiveness. Maybe a dominant thinks that they're offering structure here, but it's the emotional safety behind that structure that actually does the heavy lifting. These scenes aren't just scenes, they're stories we've lived before. So today I'm going to break this down into about 4 parts. First, we're going to talk about how desire gets shaped by our early wounds. Then how erotic coding can take place through power dynamics. We're going to spend a little time on shame and that layer, and how that often gets misread as arousal. And finally, we're going to look at what it means like to build conscious, kink-rooted in emotional safety that's not just intensity, and try to understand and a little bit unpack that for you. All right, so what am I talking about when desire meets wounding? So let's start at the root here, because when someone says, I crave discipline, or I need to be corrected to feel safe, we're not just talking about kink. We're talking about something that likely formed long ago before anyone knew what kink even was. When you grow up in an environment where love is inconsistent, you learn to adapt, you learn to survive. It's not always about dramatic abuse either. Sometimes it's a lot subtler. A parent who only shows you warmth when you've done something right, or a caregiver who's too overwhelmed to notice you unless you're, causing problems. These moments, where your emotional needs are only met through performance or disruption, leave a lasting mark. Attention gets tied to correction. Correction becomes conditional. And if your nervous system, something starts to get wired here. When I'm in trouble, I get seen. Attachment theory explains this well. John Bowlby is one of the core voices in this field. He's talked about how emotional availability in our early caregivers shapes our internal working models, our beliefs about what love actually is, what safety looks like, and how much we're allowed to need others. Attachment theory here isn't just about whether or not you were loved. It's about how love was communicated, how it was received, how it was made predictable or not. Bowlby proposed that children form internal working models, these mental blueprints for how relationships operate based on their earliest bonds, typically in childhood. These models help a child answer a question like, can I rely on others? Will they respond if I need them? And do I matter enough to be comforted? When those answers are inconsistent or unclear, a child can develop an insecure attachment pattern. Ambivalent attachment in particular often emerges when a caregiver is emotionally erratic, sometimes responsive, but sometimes they're cold or maybe they're even preoccupied. The child becomes hypervigilant, emotional, hungry, they don't really know. They're scanning constantly for cues of approval or disapproval. And as adults, These same individuals often equate love with emotional highs and lows. They seek out dynamics that echo that familiar rhythm, not because it feels good, but because it feels true. And this is where we can start to see how kink dynamics, especially ones involving discipline or correction, might tap into that whole deep early wiring. If love once, arrived hand in hand with tension, then these intense dynamics later in life, like being put in your place, being punished, being guided, can recreate the emotional voltage of those early childhood bonds. But now it's on your terms. Now you know what's coming. Now you get to choose how far you're willing to go. This is what we mean when we talk about trauma imprinting. Reenactment is rarely conscious. Nobody says, let me relive my wounds for fun. I've never heard a trauma survivor. I've never said, yeah, I think I want this to happen all over again. Let's do it because it sounds cool. No one does that, right? But the psyche here tries to make sense of the past by repeating it in ways that feel slightly more controlled. So if the original pain came from being shamed or dismissed or corrected without care, reenacting that in a negotiated dynamic where you know what's coming or you've even agreed to it can feel kind of powerful, maybe even erotic. Not because the pain is inherently pleasurable, but because it's no longer being forced on you. You're choosing it, you're inviting it, and that's a very different thing. Still, there's a deeper truth underneath the eroticism. For many of us, being punished wasn't about learning or growth. It was the doorway into connection. So if you grew up in a home where presence followed misbehavior, it makes sense that your nervous system now responds to discipline as something meaningful. Now, that's not kink gone wrong. That's emotional logic playing itself out in adult scenarios. And we see this quite often. But here's the part that people don't talk about enough. This pattern can persist even when the current relationship is healthy, even when your partner is loving, even when there is no abuse. You can still find yourself wanting that correction and perhaps even needing it, not because your partner is unsafe, but because your internal wiring here equates structure with care. Now, sometimes a submissive might say, I just need to feel that they're paying attention. And underneath that is often a long history of being invisible unless they were disrupting something. So now, in the container of DS, the scene becomes a place where they can finally feel held, not just physically, but emotionally. So yes, for some, being punished was the only time they felt seen. That pattern doesn't just disappear, it gets eroticized. It becomes part of the arousal template. And if we're not aware of that, we can confuse the repetition of healing with this. But if we are aware of it, it opens the door to something else: choice, intention, and meaning. Because sometimes what looks like submission or control or even discipline is actually someone trying to feel regulated. They're trying to feel safe. They're trying to feel reconnected. And that's where we're going to go next here, into the whole psychology of power and arousal and why the body often turns around toward the same patterns that once hurt it. So what am I actually talking about? I'm talking about erotic coding and power. So I want to stay with this question of how desire gets shaped, not just by what we feel, but how our bodies learn to interpret certain emotional experiences here. The truth is, your nervous system doesn't always separate fear and shame or arousal the way that you'd expect it. All three can activate at the same time with physiological responses: a racing heartbeat, shallow breath, heightened sensitivity, maybe sweaty or sticky palms, right? And when those emotional states get paired again and again with moments of attention or intimacy, your body starts to make connections that your conscious mind didn't sign off on. And this is what we call classical conditioning at work. If you were a child who got noticed most when you were in trouble or when you were emotionally overwhelmed, your nervous system may have started to register stress as meaningful. If being corrected was the moment that someone finally looked at you, finally took you seriously, even if that came with raised voices or punishment, that pairing sticks. attention becomes fused with tension, and your body matures that emotional intensity can become erotically charged. Not because it's healthy, but because it's familiar, gang, right? You have to understand that we start to learn and feel these patterns. Now, bring that into adulthood, into a DS dynamic, and it starts to make more sense. You're not necessarily turned on by the punishment, you know, so you don't really think of it in that respect. You're responding to the way it represents closeness, focus, and even care. That kind of wiring doesn't just dissolve because we grew up. It becomes a part of our erotic map. Object relations theory takes this step a little bit further. It looks at how the voices we internalize as children, especially those of authority figures, get carried into adult relationships, right? So, what we're looking at here is if our early caretakers were harsh or critical or even emotionally distant, that voice doesn't vanish. It often gets folded into that whole self talk that we have going on, or it's even projected outward onto our partner. So, in our kink dynamics, especially those evolving in, especially in the authority positions, this gets complicated. A submissive might not just be responding to their dominant's commands, they may be unconsciously engaging with an internalized parent voice, seeking approval, fearing rejection, trying to do it right, trying to finally earn what wasn't offered back then. And the dominant, if they aren't aware of this dynamic, might start to carry the emotional weight that was never theirs to begin with. This doesn't make this type of kink wrong, it just makes and means that the scene is doing more than it looks like on the surface. A lot of submissives I've worked with or spoken to aren't chasing punishment because they enjoyed feeling bad. They're chasing the sense of relief that comes from the correction, the calm that follows the intensity, the closeness that follows the vulnerability. What they're often seeking isn't punishment, it's regulation here. It's being seen and soothed, and that's something that most people don't know how to ask for directly, especially if their early childhood experiences made those needs feel shameful. So yes, the spanking, the discipline, those all the firm words that we use, they have their place, but it's not always about the act, it's about what the act stands for. Visibility, validation, sometimes even love. And that's the part that gets missed on the surface level, especially in these conversations when we're talking about kink and our dynamics. The erotic charge is absolutely real, but so is the psychological root beneath it. And if we don't slow down and explore what's driving it, we risk reenacting old pain with new partners, hoping for a different outcome, without ever naming the original wound. And when we get to this next part, when I start talking about shame here, I really want to dive into this wound. Because shame is often this engine running beneath these desires. It does mimic arousal. It can hide behind submission. And if we're not careful, it can become the reason we keep coming back to the scenes that look like liberation, but feel a little bit more like self-punishment. And shame is such a huge driver for so many people. We don't understand it. Shame can keep us from doing things or saying things or talking about these things. But we really need to understand why shame drives us. Now, I've talked about how the body pairs discipline with closeness and how arousal often forms around those early, emotional patterns. But we need to talk about this engine that drives us, that's running and fueling all of this beneath it. And that's shame. Shame is one of the most powerful emotional forces we carry. It's not the same as guilt. Now, guilt says, I did something bad. Shame says, I am bad. And when that message gets internalized early, it doesn't just fade over in time, right? It settles into your body. It becomes part of how you see yourself, and eventually part of how you relate to other people. And here's where things get messy. Shame and arousal often look the same inside your nervous system. Your heart races, your breathing gets a little bit quicker, right? Your skin gets hot, your body becomes a little bit hypersensitive. So when someone has carried unspoken shame for a long time, especially from childhood or their, formative relational trauma, the body doesn't always know how to separate that from sexual intensity. And this is how shame can get eroticized, Not because it feels good, because it feels familiar. If you spent your life feeling like you're too much or not enough or somehow inherently wrong, those feelings become the backdrop of your emotional world. So when you finally feel them in the scene, in a space that's negotiated where you have some level of control, it can feel like relief, like agency, like finally choosing the one thing that used to happen to you without your permission, right? Psychodynamic theory really comes into play here because it calls this a kind of masochistic adaptation. It's not about enjoying the pain, it's about reclaiming it. If I'm not going to feel bad, right, the unconscious will say, then I'll decide when and how. And that shift from passive to active can feel deeply empowering, even if the emotion underneath is still shame. But this is where it gets complicated. There's a difference between empowered submission and compulsive reenactment. Now, one comes from a lot of clarity and depth and understanding, from a place of knowing what we want and how we choose it. And the other comes from unresolved identity, where you only feel valuable when you're being corrected or punished or even handled. The second one isn't kink. That's survival showing up in leather, rope, and impact types of play. And it doesn't just play out for submissives. Dominants aren't immune to this either. I've worked with quite a few D types who feel needed when they're stepping in to correct somebody, when their worth is tied to how well they manage, fix, or even discipline a partner. And underneath that, there's often a fear of being emotionally unnecessary, of being chosen only when someone else is in chaos. So shame shame works on both sides of the slash here. It shows up as as a submissive who only feels worthy if they're in trouble, and the dominant who only feels connected when they're stepping in to correct. The power dynamic becomes a loop, one person needing to be punished to feel loved, and the other needing to punish to feel useful. But what happens here when the punishment stops? When there's no correction needed? When things are just calm? That's often when shame creeps back in. That stillness doesn't feel safe, it feels empty, because if shame was your earliest mirror, you're still trying to find love in its reflection. And this is the trap that we get stuck in. Because on the surface, it might look like a solid DS dynamic. There's rituals, there's the intensity, but emotionally, it's built on a foundation of unresolved self-perception. One that says, I'm only good when I'm being put back in my place, or I'm only desirable when I'm making someone behave. That's not erotic freedom. That's a silent contract that says, I will reenact my shame for closeness, and you'll give me the approval in return. And it burns people out. It starts to feel less like intimacy and more like a performance. Less like choice here and more like an emotional debt. So, how do you tell the difference? Well, first, you pause. You get honest with yourself. And you ask, does the scene make me feel more like myself or less? Do I leave it feeling more seen or more swallowed? Because shame-based dynamics aren't always loud. Sometimes they're wrapped in rituals and they're dressed up as obedience and structure, but that whole feeling underneath, well, that's always going to tell you the truth. Now, as we get into this next part here, I really want to talk about what it looks like to move from that into something conscious. How to build kink that heals, not that reenacts, discipline that's actually chosen, not demanded, and love that doesn't make you perform your pain just to feel close to it. And we need to understand all of these differences. What am I talking about? I'm talking about conscious kink and emotional safety and moving towards that. So if we understand that shame has shaped the map and discipline has been used to navigate it, what does it look like to take the wheel? To move from reenacting the past to rewriting that whole scenario for ourselves? Well, there is a term here that I find incredibly relevant to kink. It's what we call corrective emotional experience. Now, this was introduced by a Hungarian psychotherapist named Franz Alexander, and it refers to what happens when we go through familiar emotional situations, right? But the outcome is different this time. You still feel like the same vulnerability, the same fear, the same need, but instead of being met with abandonment or criticism or pain. You're met with care, with presence, and with regulation. Conscious kink offers that opportunity. It gives us a space where we can approach the very dynamics that once disempowered us: power, discipline, surrender, control, and engage them from a place of clarity and consent. The stimulus can be intense, right? The scene can still include punishment and guidance and correction, but now it's held in a container that says, this is for us. This dynamic is built on trust, and this place is safe for us. And when that shift happens, when the experience is chosen rather than imposed, it becomes healing. The nervous system starts to learn a new outcome. The old pattern isn't erased, but it's no longer running the show. You're not surviving it, you're reshaping it. And this is where it helps to slow down and ask, what am I actually needing in this moment? Because most of the time, the desire to be punished isn't about punishment. It's about something underneath. A longing to be seen, maybe a craving for containment, a need for reinsurance, or even forgiveness, for attunement. When you start to name those things clearly, your kink becomes sharper, cleaner, and more honest. You're not reenacting confusion, you're engaging truth. And the dynamic shifts too. Maybe a dominant in the space stops being the emotional cleanup crew for someone else's chaos. They become a steady hand offering boundaries without humiliation, direction without control. They're not trying to fix the submissive or punish them into shape. They're showing up in a role that says, I see your strength even when you need support. And a submissive, when they're working from this place, stops seeing discipline as proof that they're broken. Instead, it becomes a tool for growth, for structure, for anchoring somebody. It's not about atoning for who you are. It's about exploring who they're allowed to become safely. And when those dynamics align with something something truly powerful happens. Trust builds not just between the people involved, but inside the person. The submissive starts trusting themselves to ask what they really want. The dynamic starts trusting that their guidance is rooted in presence, not performance. But this kind of dynamic doesn't appear by accident. It takes honesty, a lot of effort, self-reflection, and self-inquiry. So if you find yourself drawn to discipline, ask yourself, what am I really asking for when I ask to be punished? Right? Because sometimes the answer isn't pain. Sometimes the answer is peace. It's repair. Sometimes it's for the safety of being noticed without being shamed or redirected, without being made to feel small. When we heal, we don't stop craving structure. We stop calling it love when it's cruelty. And that's what conscious kink can offer. Not the erasure of the past, but a chance to live through something different and have it with a different outcome, with eyes open, with a nervous system that's steady, with the freedom to say, this is who I am and I get to feel safe here. I want to say this clearly. The desire itself isn't the problem. Wanting structure, craving discipline, or finding comfort in intensity doesn't mean there's something wrong with you. But the why underneath that desire, that is worth exploring. You can still want the edge. You can still need the correction. You can still light up when the control enters the room. But you deserve to know, is it healing you or is it echoing something you've never been allowed to outgrow? So I'm going to give you a question for you all to sit with. When you crave correction here, right? When you crave discipline, what part of you is hoping to be forgiven? Now, I always welcome your thoughts, your interactions. I know it's a little bit of a deeper show this time. It's a lot of self-reflection going on, and that's kind of what I was hoping for with this one. I really appreciate this question, so I'd love to hear your thoughts or your responses in the comments section on social media. This is going to keep going there, right? I'd love for you to consider sharing this out, supporting the show, helping it grow, sharing it with others who might need to hear it, right? If you follow me on Spotify or YouTube, hit the like, subscribe button so you get notified with new episodes. Also, if you're on Spotify and you're following me, do me a favor, rate me 5 stars. That's all I'm asking. If you don't even want to donate, just do me a favor, rate the show, hit the 5 stars, hit the submit. You can only deal with that on the Spotify app. You can't do it on the desktop version. That helps me out tremendously. That's another way you can support me, right? Now, I still have to apologize to Red Warrior. I need to get her on the show. I keep trying. It's a scheduling thing for me, not her. I got to deal with that. I do have a book out. My friend's always been good. I always like giving her a shout out for this because she pushes me to promote. I do have a book out. It's called Tangled Desires, the intersection between BDSM and psychology. It's wherever you can get your ebooks. There is a print version. I always say this. It's a little repetitive. It's a little verbose, but it's okay. It's the first book I've ever written. I am working on a second book, but we'll see. I don't know if it's going to manifest. You never know, right? Talking about trauma and some other things. I'm really liking that I'm getting some new places that are asking me questions. I do have to interpret, so if you can, at least Google Translate for me or tell me where you're from. It helps me out a little bit. But I want to shout out to Bucharest because you asked me to. Thank you so much, Tokyo. I love that you're listening. I'm enjoying some of the questions I've got from you. Buenos Aires, didn't realize, but yes, your shout out for you as well. And finally, yet again, Madrid and Barcelona, always in my heart, as much as everywhere else that I've grown up in or I've been to in the world. Thank you for all of your support. As quick shout outs to you all. To the rest of you too, I appreciate it from all over the world. I'm just so, I feel so humble that you all are listening and the audience is growing. But if you have any questions or comments, drop them. Let me know your thoughts in the section. If you've got something you want to drop to me, you want me to look into, the Kink Perspective at gmail.com. Send me an email. I'll definitely consider it. There are some topics I do got to say. I have been contacted about a few. They're either not in my wheelhouse or I don't know enough, and it requires quite a bit of my time. So it's not always easy to get to some of your recommendations, and a couple of the shows or questions I've been asked, they're actually bordering on therapy, and I can't actually do that. It's not what I do, but I am happy to answer some questions, and I am happy to look at some possible things. But anyways, let me know what you thought. Sit with that question, right? Don't forget it. When you're craving that correction, what part of you is hoping to be forgiven, right? Sit with it. Let me know what your thoughts are. Until next time, everybody, be safe, stay kinky.